When you hear the word slavery, most people think first of white men and black women, fathers taken, mothers raped, children sold. That is true. But there is another, quieter wound in the history of slavery that rarely makes it into school lessons or popular documentaries: the sexual violation of black men. Men who were owned, punished, shamed, and sometimes forced into sex by white people, including white women. That violence is part of the same system that brutalized black women and children. It helped build economies, enforce power, and shape myths about black bodies that lasted long after emancipation. This is that story, messy, painful, and stubbornly real. Before I continue, kindly hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video with your loved ones. Thank you. Now, let's dive in. A simple fact that matters: under slavery in North America, enslaved people were not protected by the law. They were property. That legal fact changed everything about how bodies were treated. If you owned a person, you could sell them, beat them, force them to work, and in practice, because the law did not treat certain acts as crimes when the victim was enslaved, you could also use their bodies as you wished. That lack of legal protection meant sexual violence could be wielded without fear of meaningful legal consequences. Historians point out again and again that the law and custom together made sexual domination a regular tool of control. What do we mean by sexual violence here? Keep it plain: it's any sex that happens without consent. In slavery, consent is often impossible by definition. An enslaved man could not freely refuse a white person who had legal power over his life, liberty, and sometimes his family. Sexual violence took many shapes: physical rapes, coerced relationships, forcing men to father children, humiliating inspections and exposure, sexualized punishments, and intimate violations that were never recorded as crimes. Those acts left scars that went beyond bodies. They affected families, reputations, and the social standing of black men within both the enslaved community and white society. Why focus on abuse by white women? Because it upends a common, comfortable narrative. Most telling and studied stories about slavery's sexual violence center on white men and black women. That history is crucial and true. But white women were not mere passive spectators. Some were slaveholders. Some used sexual power. Some joined in violent control. There are documented cases where elite white women engaged in sexual relations with enslaved men, sometimes coerced, sometimes framed by observers as consensual, but always shadowed by the unequal power at the heart of slavery. White women had tools of power: household authority, control of food and shelter, direct violence, and the social authority to make accusations or mark someone's reputation. That power could be, and sometimes was, used to damage and dominate black men. That sentence, sometimes framed as consensual, matters. Contemporary witnesses, and later historians, have to untangle what looked like consent from what could safely be called coercion. When a white woman had sex with an enslaved man, the context shaped how people remembered it. If the woman was married and the relationship was discovered, the black man was almost always held responsible and punished. If the white woman was wealthy and protected by family and status, she could escape accountability. Courts, when they existed, almost always blamed the black man. Truth, what actually happened inside rooms and under covers, is often lost. But looking carefully at the records, historians now see patterns: sex across the color line that did not mean consent, and punishments that reinforced white control. Thomas A. Foster's work is a turning point here. His book, Rethinking Rufus, is the first book-length study to examine in full how enslaved men experienced sexual violation. Foster combed through court records, newspapers, slave narratives, and official documents to show not only that sexual abuse of men happened, but that it was central to how slavery worked. He reads cases where men were forced into reproductive relationships, where violence was mixed with sexual coercion, and where cultural images of black men as sexual threats were used to justify cruelty. Foster's point is simple and unsettling: sexual violence in slavery was not one-sided. Men were victims too, and their victimhood shaped family life, community memory, and even legal practices. Let's be clear about scale and evidence. The record for sexual violence against enslaved men is smaller and harder to read than the record for women. That does not mean it was rare. It means the archives are uneven. Many crimes were never written down, victims rarely testified, and where a case did hit a court, it was often shaped by the prejudices of judges and newspapers. Foster argues that archival silence itself is a kind of evidence. The system made it hard for men to speak or to be heard. Still, careful historians can detect patterns: cases of alleged sexual contact where the man received punishment, court records that expose extra-legal violence, and slave narratives with hints of sexual humiliation. Put together, these fragments show a consistent pattern of sexual domination that targeted men in ways that have been undercounted. What did these abuses look like in practice? Avoiding lurid detail, the record shows repeated forms. First, direct sexual coercion by white men and by white women who used their household power to force intimacy. Second, coerced reproduction, enslavers arranging pairings or forcing sexual encounters to produce children who increased the owner's wealth. Third, legal and communal shaming. A black man accused of sexual relations with a white woman could be arrested, publicly humiliated, branded, sold away, or lynched. Fourth, intimate violation in the form of inspections, forced nudity, and sexualized punishments that destroyed dignity. These were not isolated acts. They were woven into the daily functioning of slavery. A thorny and important pattern, accusations about sex between black men and white women were used as a tool to police black men's behavior and to terrorize black communities. After emancipation, this weapon became a powerful excuse for mob violence. The Equal Justice Initiative's work on lynching documents how accusations of sexual crimes against white women were often the pretext for extrajudicial killings of black men. Many of those accusations were false, or inflated, or served as cover for revenge, competition, or racial control. The result, a long history of violence that connected alleged sexual transgression and public terror. This is one of the brutal legacies of slavery's sexual politics. Why would white women commit sexual violence? Motives are a complicated mix of personal desire, assertions of status, sadism, and the perverse logic of ownership. Some white women used sexual favors to exert dominance over enslaved men and to reward or punish. Some involved themselves in exploitative relationships because they sought power in a household where even wives might have limited freedom. Others participated in coerced reproduction schemes because white households sought to control the generation of enslaved labor. And in several documented cases, white women acted with cruel intent, punishing, humiliating, and using sexual contact as a method of control. It is essential to resist simple explanations and instead see this as part of a system in which women could exercise power within limits and sometimes harm the people they owned. There are historical examples that show the range of outcomes. Foster's case studies include stories where men were accused and punished for relationships with white women. Other records show white women whose sexual misbehavior disrupted households and led to family scandal, while the black men involved suffered brutal consequences. In some legal records, a white woman's complaint could send a man to jail or to the lash, even if the relationship had elements of mutuality or had persisted for years. The unequal treatment was clear. A white woman's reputation was judged by whiteness and class, a black man's body was judged by suspicion. That unequal justice helped cement myths about black male criminality, myths that justified violent social control long after slavery ended. At times, accusations led to the worst outcome, death. The fear of black men sexually violating white women, even when false, became a pretext for lynchings and mob murders. After the Civil War, when white communities sought to reassert racial dominance, charges that a black man had assaulted or threatened a white woman could provoke immediate, violent justice from mobs. The consequences for black men could be fatal, regardless of truth. This pattern is both an outgrowth of slavery and an instrument of white supremacist enforcement during Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era. Another important point, the cultural imagination around black masculinity shaped both the abuse and the reaction to it. In art, literature, and public discourse, black men were often depicted as hypersexual and dangerous. That racist stereotype made it easy to blame black men and to justify extreme punishments for alleged sexual acts. Historians trace how visual culture, from paintings to broadsheets, eroticized and then criminalized black male bodies, creating a doubled injury, physical sexual violence by white people, plus public demonization that could lead to torture and murder. This cultural framing helped to sustain the cycle of abuse and to hide who the actual perpetrators were. It is worth saying something about the sources we rely on and why historians must read them carefully. Slave narratives, court records, WPA interviews, letters, plantation journals, and newspapers are the key archives. Each brings its own bias. Newspapers often smeared black men, court records recorded only what owners, juries, or biased judges wanted to hear. Oral histories can hold memories shaped by shame or silence. Foster's method, reading against the grain and cross-checking different kinds of documents, helps recover stories that would otherwise vanish. Scholars also use the absence of testimony as a clue. When men's voices are missing, that absence itself tells us about power and erasure. So what does modern scholarship say, in short? First, sexual violence against enslaved men happened and did so in many forms. Second, white women were sometimes perpetrators, as mistresses, wives, and household managers, and they could inflict sexual harm both directly and indirectly. Third, the law and culture took black male-accused actors far more harshly, feeding a cycle of punishment and terror. Fourth, historians are only now beginning to name, quantify, and analyze these harms in ways that change our understanding of how slavery worked. Names and anecdotes matter because they make the abstract real. One example historians use is the life of Rufus as Foster reconstructs it. Rufus was forced into a reproductive pairing that left women and men damaged, and the story shows how reproductive coercion could operate in ways that historians had long ignored. Other records show cases where men were punished for kissing a white woman's hand, or for passing a white woman's home, acts that today sound trivial but then could be used as proof of impropriety and lead to lynching. Even when those accusations were false, their effect on black families and communities was profound. We should also be honest about scale. The story of sexual abuse of enslaved men is not a tidy parallel to the sexual violence faced by enslaved women. Women's experiences, rape, forced breeding, sexual slavery, and the sexual vulnerability of girls, were widespread and differently shaped by gendered power. That is not an either-or choice. Both experiences happened within the same system. Studying men's experiences adds complexity and shows that sexual violence was a systemic tool used against anyone with an enslaved body, regardless of gender. It broadens our understanding rather than diminishing any other. What about outside the United States? The sexual violation of enslaved men is not unique to American slavery. Scholars of the wider Atlantic world find similar patterns: ownership, forced reproduction, sexual coercion, and the use of sexual accusations to control colonized and enslaved populations. This is a global pattern tied to empire, racial ideologies, and patriarchal control. While legal details and cultural norms differ, the basic power relationships that made sexual violence possible recur in many slave societies. For an African history channel, this link matters. The transatlantic trade and colonial regimes created conditions where bodies were commodities, and that commodification had sexual consequences everywhere. How does this history touch the present? Two blunt ways: memory and myth. First, memory. Families and communities carry stories, sometimes private, sometimes never spoken, of humiliation and loss. Those memories shape identity and distrust of institutions. Second, myth. The stereotype of the dangerous black male continues to be invoked in criminal justice, media, and politics. The long arc from plantation sexual politics to modern policing is not a direct line, but the cultural residues are clear. Myths born in slavery influenced who was believed and who was punished in later eras. Organizations documenting lynching and racial terror show how sexual accusations continued to be used as tools of racial control well into the 20th century.